Hey all, here OS Reviews. You're watching our video review of the Chuwi Hi Pad, a 10.1-inch Android gaming tablet that sells for only $130. So the biggest question here is whether or not this is an example of good performance or if it's just fashion over form. So let's find out. Starting with the design, the Hi Pad does look fairly premium. It has a very gaming-centric look. The entire back body is made out of aluminum, so it feels very solid, and we do have these chamfered edges that reflect off the light. And overall definitely looks more expensive than the price would suggest. It does have a tapered edge, however, that gets a little bit steeper as you move upwards. And one potential downside is if you have this tablet flat on a surface, it does wobble a little bit as a result of having these prism-like shapes on the back. On the very top here, on the top, there's access to a micro SD card slot for expanding the built-in memory, as well as a 3.5mm headphone jack. There's also a USB Type-C port, which is great because it supports faster charging, and there's nothing else on the other side. Now, the two bottom grills here are actually used for the speakers, so that's where the sound comes out of. It's a slightly unfortunate design because for a gaming-centered product, I do wish the speakers would be at least on the front. Nonetheless, on the front, we have a 10.1-inch Full HD display. It's an IPS panel which is laminated, so there's no gap between the glass and the screen underneath. You can tell that the bezel size here is considerable, but not too bad. For a tablet, it makes it still easier to hold and still interact with games without touching parts of the display, so I'll give them a pass there. There are no plastic pieces at all for the antenna strips, so again, just feels very premium, much better than the price would suggest. So taking a closer look at the software next, we are greeted to Android Oreo 8.0 out of the box, which I would say is still relatively up to date. Of course, Android 9 is slowly rolling out, but as a budget-oriented device, I'm not going to ding it too much for coming with Android 8.0. Other hardware specifications include the Helio X27, which is a Deca core, coupled with 3GB of RAM and 32GB of built-in storage. So again, these specs are not going to be mind-blowing. It's not going to be a rival to something like a Snapdragon 845. But it is fairly in line with something like a Snapdragon 660 when it comes to synthetic benchmarks. So we are talking about adequate performance here for things like casual gaming, but if you're expecting lightning fast performance in terms of instantly loading up games like Asphalt 9 or PUBG, you may be a little bit disappointed. With that being said, again, the price here is only $130, so we do have to keep our expectations tempered. Alright, so the UI here is very simple. There's a drag up gesture to access the shade of all our applications. Of course, we can also drag down anywhere on the display to pull down and change things like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth settings. On the left here, we do also have a shade that's dedicated for Assistant that will pull through news feeds and articles relevant to your past history. You can also access Assistant or say, OK Google, instantly do some Google searches, and the microphone is actually pretty good when it comes to sensing your voice. In terms of preloaded applications, there's really not a ton on here, which is definitely good. So there's basically no bloatware. We just have a handful of standard Google apps, including YouTube, Gmail, Drive, Photos, and the Play Store, and that's essentially it. So let's start by taking a closer look at the camera. The interface is very similar to a blown-up version of what you'll find on a lot of these Chinese phones, which is to say it's not the most beautiful UI in the world, but it's functional. There is HDR that you can toggle on. You can also create a panorama, and over here you can select scenes and filters as well. The resolution is definitely quite low, and there's no stabilization of any sort, so if you shake it, it will definitely blur out the image. There's a lot of overexposure. So overall, again, the camera here is probably one of the weakest aspects of this tablet, but then again, on a tablet in general, you don't need an amazing camera, but for just capturing basic objects for things like scanning in documents, I would say it's more than functional. And speaking of photos, I would say that the display in general is fairly satisfactory. It's bright, it offers good, accurate looking colors, even though they're not quite as saturated as on an AMOLED panel. And in terms of brightness, it does get quite bright, especially at the maximum settings, so you really won't have any issues when it comes to viewing this back, even when there's plenty of light in the background. I did find that at the minimum settings, the screen was still a little bit too bright for my likings, especially if you're using it in complete darkness, but overall I would say it's a good panel for the price, and it has, again, very generous viewing angles. In addition, the touch responsiveness on this unit is also quite good, so I didn't really have any issues when it comes to it responding to the lightest touches of my fingers, and it supports up to 10 fingers for multi-touch. I also point out that the haptics engine on this tablet are excellent. This is something I commented in the unboxing first impressions, and I still stand by it. So essentially, if you tap on any of the buttons below, or if you're playing back a game and you hit a wall or something, the entire thing will vibrate using the vibration motors, of course, and it just feels very natural and seamless. I will point out that the reception on the Hi Pad isn't the strongest. I, again, pointed this out in the unboxing, but maybe it's because the entire thing is encased in metal. For whatever reason, I consistently get 1 or 2 bars less of Wi-Fi compared to the Hi 9 Pro and other Android tablets that I have. If you're trying to download a lot of large files, such as Asphalt 9 or PUBG, you definitely have to wait a little bit longer, or you have to be closer to the router. So I do wish that the antennas could be improved. The tablet being completely made out of metal is actually a little bit on the chunky side, so it does weigh a bit more than, say, an Apple iPad. So if you hold this for longer periods of time, like watching a movie that might be 2 or 3 hours, there can definitely be a little bit more strain, since it's by no means the lightest tablet in the world, especially at 10 inches. Secondly, the sound quality is only so-so. Again, a little bit disappointing for a gaming tablet, just because sound, I think, is an important part of gaming and entertainment in general. It does get reasonably loud, and you can always use the standard headphone jack or use Bluetooth if you want to improve on that experience. Other productivity aspects of the tablet, including accessing email, is actually done very well, just because, again, it is running on a pretty up-to-date version of Android, and we are getting all the auto updates for these apps like Gmail. So we have split screen by default now on this horizontal view, where we can see our emails that we can scroll through, and we can also see the contents of the email on the side here. Let's do a quick web browsing test using Chrome, and we're going to load up something like the New York Times. As you can see here, a very complex page, lots of ads and images and text, but it's doing a reasonable job. If we try demanding the desktop site, let's see if that will render here. And we do have a second tab actually open right now. This is just showing kind of what the tablet is, another desktop version of the site, and again, pretty complex, lots of images and ads, but it seems to be doing all right. You have to wait a little bit longer for some certain parts, such as images, to completely load, but there's not too much checkerboarding, and scrolling as a whole is still quite smooth. So closing out of the programs that you don't really need to use anymore, you can still get relatively smooth performance, but obviously it's not going to compare to 8 or 6 gigs of RAM. All right, so again, the New York Times here is still loading along, but overall it looks fairly impressive. I can also pinch the zoom really easily. Everything feels quite smooth. The X27 is doing very well in terms of thermals. Actually, even using the tablet now for more than an hour, it still is relatively cool. The back of the unit is still, again, not getting hot or warm at all. Same thing goes with gaming. After using it for longer than 30 or 45 minutes, on usually a smartphone it gets quite hot, but on here it still is very cold to the touch with the metal. So I think they're doing a great job with the heat dissipation. Maybe the ventilation has something to do with it. Something else I'm impressed with would be the battery performance so far. It does have a 7,000 milliamp hour capacity pack, which is relatively large on a tablet. It will definitely last you for about 2 to 3 days of use before you need to recharge it again. That is with moderate usage in between. If you're doing an extensive gaming session, you may have to charge it at the end of a day or a day and a half, but overall performance is quite good. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about apps next. Again, with 32 gigs of built-in storage, it's a little bit on the low side, so you have to be a bit more careful about not just downloading every single game that you see in the Play Store, but again, all titles are supported. You can always supplement the memory, though, with a micro SD card, and it can be used as internal memory, which is definitely good to see. And in terms of some titles here, just starting off, let's just tap on, let's say, Color Snake. So this represents a more simple title that is rather 2D in terms of graphics, and you can tell here that loading speeds are still fairly quick, again, as expected, since it's a very simple game, but there's no real issues when it comes to performance here, and load up speeds are going to be, again, very similar to something like a Snapdragon 660 smartphone. And again, as long as you are kind of diligent about not having a ton of apps open in the background, you'll still get a fairly smooth overall experience. Still in the same concept of using a snake to play around, but the graphics here are definitely more challenging and demanding, just because we have more kind of 3D animations, but you can tell here that it's still doing a pretty good job. Overall, I would say that the screen here is quite responsive. You can also connect it to a Bluetooth controller. It's still not quite as demanding as, say, a game such as Asphalt 9 or PUBG Mobile, but overall, you can see it's getting a bit more complex. Again, the screen here is doing a very good job in terms of offering us very good viewing angles, good brightness overall, and again, the frame rates here are still quite smooth, not really too much stuttering going on. And of course, the tablet remains quite cool in temperature and still has pretty decent battery performance even as we are gaming. And now moving into some more demanding type games, such as arcade style, kind of fighting style. You can see that loading on the bottom is going to take a little bit longer, but definitely still very much playable. So if we kind of skip some of these tutorials here, we can move around and kind of fight our way. And you can see that there's a little bit of choppiness here and there as I'm moving very quickly, but overall it doesn't really hinder the performance too much. You can definitely still enjoy it without any real issues. Still makes for a pretty immersive overall experience here. So overall takeaway is it works better than I expected for things like gaming. It's not going to give you, true flagship level performance in terms of the best frame rates, especially at the highest settings. Now we have all these games open in the background, but they're still kind of running here, and the 3 gigs of RAM seems to be managing it, again, better than expected. Even though this tablet doesn't have an active stylus, you can still use your fingers to doodle along, and again, it is quite sensitive and precise in our testing so far. So you can also get some work done, so it doesn't have to be just entertainment and play. It still handles other tasks, again, like PowerPoint, Word, Drive, things like that, pretty well. So that's the Chuwi Hi Pad. I'm actually pleasantly surprised because at only 130 bucks, even if this was just a regular kind of low-end tablet, it would still be super affordable. Not to mention it has a very unique look going on. Obviously, if you compare this with more expensive tablets, maybe Surfaces or the iPad Pro, it's going to fall short in areas like having larger bezels and having, even smoother performance with more RAM. So in that sense, I wouldn't say it's quite, premier gaming grade. So if you're willing to accept those compromises, I think this is a good choice to consider. So you can learn more details about this in the links down below, but for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the Chuwi Hi Pad, a 10-inch gaming tablet that sells for only 130 bucks.